So we continue, let's say, the cat will stay or not, as he wishes. So before photography, there were of course painters and portraits, and here we have some examples of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert dressed up in fancy dress for the balls organized at Buckingham Palace. There were a few, at least 3, I remember, such balls, and they were not masquerades, they were not masked balls, but they were fancy dress balls with a theme. And the theme was also was always historical. So the first ball was called the Plantagenet ball and was set in this kind of medieval time frame. The second one was called the Restoration Ball and was set in the 17th century, the time of the restoration of the Stuarts after the Civil War, so after the fall of Oliver Cromwell. And the third one was called the Powder Ball, and this was set in the 18th century, of course, before the French Revolution. So here we have a portrait of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, painted by Sir Edwin Landseer, one of the favorite artists of Victoria, dressed up for the Plantagenet ball. This was in the early 40s, so they were still young. They didn't have all their children yet, and the children were too small to attend, definitely. We have some children dressed up as page boys, slightly here in the background of this portrait, but I guess these were some children of other aristocrats or court members, rather than the children of Victoria and Albert themselves. They would be too small. The idea, the inspiration here was King Edward III and his wife Queen Philippa. This was well researched, and actually researching and planning and designing was always a very important part of the preparation for such a ball. And this was usually done in close collaboration between the designer and the wearer. So I guess the idea for the inspiration came from the Queen herself. She wanted to emphasize that Albert was very important to her, that she was madly in love with him, and she definitely wanted to promote him as this kind of head of the family, the alpha male. She was a very strong personality, but she wanted to believe that Albert was even stronger. So she decided to cast him as the reigning monarch. Here, King Edward III, one of the kings who was remembered in history for a long, successful reign. He was remembered as a great lawgiver, as a kind of peace-loving administrator, and generally a kind of good king. Not really a military hero, but a good administrator, and also he was at least remembered in history as a happy husband. So his marriage to Queen Philippa was presented in history as happy and long and fruitful. So Victoria decided to cast herself as the queen consort, not the reigning monarch, and Albert as the proper king. But of course everybody knew she was the reigning monarch. So here in this portrait she takes center stage. This was actually inspired by I think the effigies of the king and queen from their tomb in Westminster Abbey. So there were like proper historical inspirations, of course adjusted to the modern sensibility, to the modern times. I guess the silhouette of the Queen's dress is more Victorian than medieval. This is before the crinoline yet, definitely, but the whole inspiration, it's more about inspiration than, let's say, historical accuracy. The second image, it is by Winterhalter, whom you already met, shows the Queen and Prince Albert dressed up for Restoration Ball a few years later, and they are dressed in some sort of late 17th century costumes, something from the court of, let's say, King Charles II, the Merry Monarch. I'm not sure they posed as King Charles II and his wife, because their marriage was not really very happy and he was a notorious womanizer, although he was remembered in history as a merry monarch, so someone who loved the parties, who loved the women, who was basically a kind of nice, easygoing person. So here we have the royal couple dressed in the clothes inspired by the second half of the 17th century. The third image, also by Franz Xaver Winterhalter, shows the costumes for the powder ball, so the ball with the 18th century theme, and this is not the king and queen, but two of their daughters. The shorter one is the eldest, the Princess Royal, Princess Victoria, or Vicky as she was called in the family. The taller person here is also a daughter, Princess Alice. And they are dressed, as you can see, in this kind of stylized 18th century costumes, made probably of embroidered silk and worn with powdered wigs. I'm not sure the children would stay for the whole duration of the ball, but they were allowed to have their own costumes made, and probably they would greet the guests at the very beginning, stay for a while, see the costumed guests, and perhaps then retire to their own parts of the palace. But this is interesting. This is a rare example of a girl who's old enough to be wearing dresses, dressed in the clothes of a little boy. So it tells you something about Victorian culture. They were not obsessed with gender roles as much as we think them to be, if they allowed a younger daughter who looks, I don't know, between 6 and 8 maybe. I don't really remember, I'd have to check when this ball took place, but they were still young to be dressed as a boy. So something interesting. Some more photographs from the turn of the century of aristocrats dressed up for fancy dress balls in some sort of historicizing costumes. The man in the first photograph looks like he's wearing something from the Tudor period, perhaps. The lady on the second photograph is also wearing something 18th century inspired, probably a kind of Marie Antoinette theme or so, but again adapted to the fashion of the Belle Epoque, with the hourglass figure with the pointed bodies. So it's like a kind of cross between what was then fashionable in the mainstream and what would be the inspirations with history. Here we have another photograph taken of some people dressed up in what looks to be a fancy dress party with some sort of the Far Eastern theme. So everybody's wearing Japanese, I think, clothes. I already mentioned in the previous part that in the last quarter of the 19th century there was a fashion for all things Japanese. There was a very successful exhibition in London, and everybody in the high society was fascinated for a while with all things Japanese, which might include dressing up in kimonos or organizing fancy dress parties to display like the fashionable new furniture or other artistic objects to have at home. Two more images. One is another fashion plate. I found this was a fashion plate for some sort of Halloween themed party. I'm not sure really. If you know more, I'll be very interested to hear from you if you take time to research that, whether Halloween parties were popular. But anyway, the lady is wearing a bat costume. Not very scary, but you can see the bat's head as the head decoration, and the cape in the shape of bat's wings. So sometimes they can be quite fancy. The last thing is actually one of my students noticed this dress in one of the earlier parts when we talk about the mainstream fashion of the Belle Epoque, and I only remembered it was a Worth dress, so from the atelier of Worth. But my student observed that it didn't really follow the current fashion so well, and she checked, and yes, this was a dress for a fancy dress party. Again, something probably inspired by the 18th century. Apparently this was quite a fashion to go back 100 or 120 years in their inspirations for the clothes. So if you remember to seeing this dress before, now you can see it in the proper context. This was not a mainstream dress for a ball or some sort of I don't know, dinner party or whatever. It wouldn't be for a ball because the sleeves are long, but for a fancy dress party that was more about the historical inspiration than, let's say, following the current fashions. So that's it. That's the end of the course. We have covered it all. When I see you next time, we'll talk about what you need to do to get the credit for participation and to pass the exam and everything. And the last thing I would like to say is a big, big thank you to my husband Michał, who is on the other side of this camera, and he suffered this course for the entire semester, recording the videos and inserting all the images and uploading the videos for you. So I would really like to say a big, big thank you. Thank you so much. Love you. Bye bye. Thank you.